Thank you everyone for coming, sharing your day with me. I'm excited to be able to show you, share with you some information about my passion in life. And I get to use my passion to help others. In the past 20 years, personal and professionally, I've helped families with trauma or worked through traumatic experiences. So I want to share that information with you today. But in saying that, my name is Michelle Butler. I have a master's degree in family counseling and therapy. I'm a certified trauma therapist, and I have various studies that I have went through and gone through in regards to trauma. So what we're going to do is talk about trauma, understanding it, being able to define it, recognizing it, and the effects of it. The objectives that we're going to use today are you're going to be able to define it, describe it, and in your own words be able to identify it. You'll be able to tell the difference between different traumas, name at least 3 of them, and also be able to describe what the effects of trauma is. You'll be able to recall and assess the information, be able to use this information to apply your knowledge to help others. So what we're going to talk about is, what is trauma? What does trauma mean to you? When someone asked you to define trauma, what would you say?
Got shot.
Divorce. Divorce.
Car accident.
Car accident.
Illness.
Illness.
Someone got shot.
Someone got shot. What else?
War.
War.
What about weather-related instances? Sometimes
Hurricanes.
Hurricanes, tsunamis.
Tornadoes, tsunamis, yeah, weather.
Okay. So weather. These are all really good answers. Let's give everyone a hand for participating. Thank you. Okay, so when we think about trauma, Webster's dictionary says if trauma is a behavior state that is a result of severe mental, emotional, or physical injury. I'm going to share with you today a video that is going to talk about trauma, and it's also going to talk about the effects of trauma.
What is trauma? When I say that word, it is likely that every student will have a different image come to mind. Please share your initial reaction in a discussion board post. I'd like to share a couple different official definitions of trauma with you now. As defined by the American Psychological Association, trauma is an emotional response to a terrible event, like an accident, rape, or natural disaster. Immediately after the event, shock and denial are typical. Longer-term reactions include unpredictable emotions, flashbacks, strained relationships, and even physical symptoms like headaches or nausea. While these feelings are normal, some people have difficulty moving on with their lives. So that's our first definition. Our second definition comes from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, abbreviated SAMHSA, which is a government agency responsible for overseeing the National Center for Trauma-Informed Care. According to SAMHSA, trauma results from an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or threatening, that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning, and physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So you can learn from these definitions that there really is no set definition of what constitutes a traumatic event. A traumatic event can be something that happens one time, like a car accident, house fire, or a natural disaster. It can be something that happens repeatedly over time, such as chronic physical abuse or neglect. Or it can be a set of circumstances that converge to result in an experience of trauma. Ultimately, the experience of trauma results from a situation that overwhelms a person's ability to cope and leaves the person with a sense of helplessness. Who does trauma affect? Trauma is universal. It can affect anyone. It doesn't matter how old you are, what race you are, or what your gender or sexual orientation are. Trauma does not discriminate. It can affect anyone, and as we will learn, research indicates that at some point, trauma does affect almost everyone. So if everyone experiences trauma, everyone gets it, why should we even worry about it? We have to worry about it, because trauma is incredibly destructive. Lots of studies have shown that exposure to trauma in childhood can have absolutely devastating consequences throughout the lifespan. Childhood trauma, defined as a traumatic event experienced any time before the age of 18, has been associated with a significantly increased risk of negative health and social outcomes. Let's look at some examples of this. Childhood trauma is strongly associated with mental health disorders in adulthood. More than half of the people who seek psychiatric care as adults either experienced abuse or neglect in childhood or witnessed domestic violence. Childhood trauma is strongly linked to substance abuse disorders. For example, in 2/3 of individuals suffering from alcoholism, the addiction is directly attributed to childhood trauma. And 75% of women in substance abuse treatment have been sexually abused or raped at some point in their life. Trauma in childhood is linked to increased risk of disease and disability in adulthood, including significant increases in rates of liver disease, COPD, autoimmune disease, ischemic heart disease, and lung cancer. Individuals who are victims of traumatic events in childhood are also at a significantly increased risk of further victimization in adulthood through both domestic violence and rape. Across the lifespan, individuals who have experienced a traumatic event are more likely to be incarcerated. For example, in California, 70% of prisoners have been in foster care at some point in their childhood, meaning that they were also subjected to neglect or abuse significant enough to require their removal from their biological parents. Exposure to trauma also correlates with a statistically significant decrease in life expectancy.
Okay, so what I want you to do is pair up with the person next to you and talk about 3 types of trauma that you learned from the video and also the effects of trauma. You can name just one effect that you heard or ever how many that you want to choose.
Whatever childhood trauma. Substance abuse trauma. Then there was like, like this trauma, like rape, natural disaster. I don't know, they call that kind of trauma, emotional trauma. So, and the effects can range from all these things like associated mental health disorders, that can have increased risk. They get out, foster care, cause people to go to jail, so it's just a lot of different ones, so that's kind of what I jotted down. I was taking notes.
Okay. So, can I get one from your group to list what you came up with?
Well, one of the types of traumas was childhood trauma.
Childhood trauma?
Childhood trauma. You want me to go up there and write childhood trauma? Okay. Did I?
Uh-oh.
Come up with another one now. Childhood trauma.
Okay, what was another one?
Well, we said domestic violence.
domestic violence. Okay, and what's another one that was mentioned in the video?
Substance abuse.
Substance abuse.
That was our favorite one too.
So when we look at these three types of trauma, what did it talk about in the video that was the effects of it?
Childhood trauma was incarceration
Incarceration.
or jail time.
Okay. What was the effects on domestic violence?
Well, what I got out of the video, one thing was that 75% of the women that are in substance abuse centers are because of domestic violence.
75% of women.
That are in substance abuse centers are because of domestic violence situations. Which that's,
It's a large,
that's,
Yeah.
yeah.
yeah, very, very scary. What about substances?
Well, that would lead to all kinds of things.
Yeah. Jail.
Yeah.
Health conditions,
Yeah.
jail,
Jail, substance centers, and
so on and so forth.
death, yeah.
Divorces, broken family.
What about, one of the things that they talked about is in your childhood, the men that are incarcerated, a lot of that stems from childhood trauma that they endured as they got
70%.
older.
Foster
Yeah.
care in California.
70%.
70%.
70%,
It's a lot.
that is a lot.
70%.
Okay, so we've talked about the three types of trauma, and we've talked about the effects of trauma. Okay, so in saying these things, we see that trauma not only affects a person, but it can affect them mentally, physically, emotionally, socially, and their overall well-being. It can affect their health. It can affect them mentally. Domestic violence is not only physically, it's psychologically also part of it. Okay, and also I want the message that I sent you guys to your phones. I need you to log on to that telephone number that I sent you. So when we're talking about trauma, and we're talking about the different effects of it, would you say that true or false, can trauma be defined by a certain situation? When you think about trauma and traumatic experiences.
Do we have to answer this on the phone?
So on number one, if you'll answer, type in 1 and then type in T or F for your answer for number 1. On question number 2, would divorce be considered trauma? Is that true or false? And on number 3, would bullying be considered trauma? See, we talk about what has happened to adults, but what about children? Traumatic things that can happen to children. Okay, so from what I'm seeing, majority of everyone is in agreement that all 3 of these questions are true. That it can be determined by a certain situation, but your idea of trauma and my idea of trauma may be totally different. What you mentioned before, the weather. Who would have ever thought about trauma affecting someone just by being in a hurricane, or what's happened with tsunamis, okay? So, when we talk about trauma, there's various and different types of trauma. One thing that comes to mind for me, because I work in the field that I work in as a therapist, is complex trauma. I work with a lot of children that have been brought into foster care. You really don't think about, it is a traumatic experience for them, but when you're talking about complex trauma, you're describing it as multiple or prolonged exposure to trauma or traumatic events. Let's say a child lives in a home with domestic violence. That's traumatic. A child that witnesses that as part of that. A child that is physically something done to them. That's another traumatic event. A child when the police shows up at the door and the parents are arrested in front of the child. That's trauma. Parents are taken into custody. Child's put into foster care. This is what you would consider complex trauma, and it's just one traumatic event after another. Another type of trauma that I've thought about is refugee trauma. These are people that live in countries where they're constantly being exposed to war, violence, or even torture. These families are asked to be relocated to other countries, countries that they have never been to in their lives, and having to move because of the violence that is there. Even in the United States, let's think about the immigrants that live in the United States with the recent laws being passed about them being deported. That's very traumatic. Imagine the children that are born here that are U.S. citizens, but their parents are not. And their parents are having to leave. That's traumatic not only for the parents, but for the children too. Okay? So, I thought I would share with you guys my favorite thing in the whole world, which is comic book characters. So when I'm thinking about trauma, they started coming to mind. One of my favorite comic book characters is Batman. So if you really know everything about Batman, you know the story of him and his family are going to dinner and theater one evening, and they're approached in the alley by a thief that's going to rob them. And all of a sudden, everything gets out of hand because the dad starts, defending and trying to protect his family, and both parents are shot right in front of him. So not only did he witness being robbed, but he saw his parents murdered in front of his eyes, which led him to grow up to become who he was, which was to get rid of the evil, the bad guys in the world. Okay, that would be considered complex trauma. Being subjected to one thing after another. Falling in the cave, and being surrounded by bats and everything could be considered traumatic. Another one is Superman. Let's take a look at Superman. He'd be considered a refugee. His mother and father loved him enough to put him in this capsule because his world, as he knows it, is about to explode around him. And he's sent to Earth, and they're hoping and praying he survives and be raised by a totally different family from his own family. So these are just examples of, kind of something to look at when you think about superheroes. I don't know if anybody is familiar with them, but can anybody name a superhero that they think may have suffered trauma, in their lives?
The Incredible Hulk.
The Incredible Hulk. All right. Tell me about the Incredible Hulk.
The Incredible Hulk goes through a transformation in his body that he can't control when he becomes angry. And he can't recall what he has done or where he has been.
Okay.
And it changes not only his mental capacity, but it changes his physical being as well.
So transformation,
Transformation.
okay. What's another one?
Spider-Man.
Spider-Man's always Uncle Phil. So that led him to develop his powers and protect those against the evil.
What about his parents dying and him being raised by
Yeah,
his
he
aunt
saw.
and uncle, losing his parents, abandonment? What about being bit by a spider?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. What about Wonder Woman? What can we come up with Wonder Woman? Who was Wonder Woman raised by? Her mother. She didn't know her father. Her father was supposedly Zeus.
It's true.
Single mom. So you think she could, have some abandonment issues that can be traumatic, being raised on an island away from everybody else, isolation. What about being thrown into a completely different world? Because if she's isolated on this island, she doesn't know other human beings, just women. That's the only women. So now she's thrown into a world full of war, but also full of other human beings separate from herself. So that can be traumatic, having to move to other countries. So in a way, that's a big adjustment. Move to another world. So these are just examples of trauma and different types of trauma, give you a little bit of an idea of how to recognize it. So today, with your learning objectives, I hope you're able to define trauma, to describe trauma in your own words, be able to tell the difference between them, and be able to talk to others about trauma, be able to recognize it, and define the effects of trauma. Be able to recall the information that you've shared today and be able to utilize it in your own way. So tell me on the sticky notes that I provided for you, just a few things that you've learned today in this presentation.
I never knew weather would be considered a type of trauma. Never really thought of it that way.
Yeah, I didn't either.
Well, the only reason I know that is because working at school and with kids and parents, and anytime there's anything weather going on outside, first thing they do is they want to come and get their kids, and we're like, we're in the middle of a tornado warning.
Yeah.
We can't let you out of this building in your vehicle with this child. And they're like, but I'm just freaked out, and I can't, it's evident that they have been traumatized at one time in their life by a tornado or a hurricane or something, and they just lose all control. And so then they created that fear amongst their kids, and we see it time and time again. You can have a fire alarm going off, and they're concerned, but nothing like weather, and I had never seen that. If I hadn't been working in a school system, I probably wouldn't have ever seen weather-related trauma either. But it's real, and it's there, and it's something. It's like they come unglued, and they just start panicking. I'm like, it's okay, we're safe. Your kids are safe, they're dry, we got them. But they can't wrap their head around that. They just fear it. I guess because the fear of the unknown with the weather, they just can't,
And they don't think about how the kids are probably safer in this cement building and more protected than they would if they were at home,
But the parent just sees, I gotta
Yeah.
have my kid.
Yeah.
Even if we get blown away together, I've gotta have my kid with them. And so they just, I think it's more of the parents, but then I think about these kids are gonna grow up to be that parent.
Yeah,
So if they don't change that cycle, I mean,
it's a mindset.
they're always
Yeah.
gonna be scared of the weather.
Well, and not only that, you can create fear in the kids in other areas too, not just in that. So you're building the kids up to be afraid. Yeah, I've seen that time and time again. So what I want to leave with you today is one of my favorite scriptures. In Joshua 1:9 it says, "Have I not commanded thee, be strong and of good courage, do not be afraid, neither be dismayed, for the Lord thy God is with you wherever you go." So I have to remind myself sometimes that, you know, it's like you said, I get afraid and I get upset, and then I think, okay, God's in control of all of this, and I just take a deep breath and just think about, okay, well, it's not, maybe I'm making it worse than what it is, you know, and I try to calm myself down to where, you know, I am able to not be afraid anymore. So, okay, well, this is just additional information that I provide. I'm not endorsing anybody. In case you want to know more about trauma, Harvard is doing a very good study right now. It's perfect for your school setting on how trauma affects children, to where when they come to school that they're not able to function and not able to concentrate. And sometimes some people see it as behavior problems, when you don't know what's going on behind closed doors that could be happening to that child. So, you know, there's a lot of really good information on these different companies, universities, websites that I've been able to utilize some of it in some of my studies. So, with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and close out our presentation. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. If you need additional information, please let me know. And as you're leaving, if you will just put your sticky note on the board where it says what I've learned today. That way I can read it and be able to improve in some areas if I need to, or maybe tweak a little bit of things that I've presented today. So thank you so much for coming, and I appreciate you being here.